Hey, Mr. Hudson. All right. These slides are on the coursework page, so if you want to get your laptop out and follow along, that's fine. And you can follow along at home. I hope everybody can see this. Again, as you've noticed, I have been recording these things, and I'm recording right now, so anything you can't see or don't hear, whether you're here or not, you can come back and watch these. I've noticed that if the recordings are more than about 30 minutes, it takes about a day to upload the videos. So I'm going to try to keep things to 30 minutes or less. And hopefully that'll be true today. So we talked a little bit about chapter 4, and we're going to finish up chapter 4 today. It's very chemistry oriented, which for some of you might make you happy and others might make you scared. And we'll spend all next week on chapter 5. So just make sure you're keeping up with your reading. What else did I want to say? Oh, we're going to cover functional groups today on one of the slides, and also on your coursework page is a functional group practice where you'll just have a chance to go through and try to identify some functional groups, but again, I'll talk about them first. So that's how we'll finish up class today. A little fun sheet, no grade, just for fun. Okay. So here are 4 really common elements that you find in living things. And there are a few different viewpoints that you have up here for these elements, including the really old Bohr model of the atom, and then just a simple dot diagram, or as they call it, a Lewis dot structure. Now, I just want to remind you about these valence electrons that these different elements have. If you don't know the trick for looking at a periodic table and just quickly looking and counting up how many valence electrons there are, I can show you that at some point. But for the most part, you won't really need, I'm not going to give you random elements and ask you to tell me things about valence electrons. That's chemistry, this is biology. But one thing I really want to point out is carbon here with how many valence electrons? 4. That's what the 4 single dots represent. All right? And the fact that they are single dots indicates that these electrons are available to make what? Covalent bonds. That's right. And when we draw these covalent bonds out in our molecular structure drawings, how do we draw covalent bonds?
2 lines.
Well, with a line
Will you share the
showing the sharing of the electrons. But 2 lines would represent actually a double bond, which is something you might be drawing 2 lines, and we'll look at some examples like that. So in the case of nitrogen, you have 5 valence electrons, but how many covalent bonds are you going to be making?
3.
It can make up to 3 covalent bonds. That's right. With oxygen, how many?
2?
2 covalent bonds. And by the way, these are all written out down here. And then hydrogen, with its 1 lonely electron, can make 1 bond. I'm losing my voice from 2 weeks of talking after months of not talking much. All right, so we're going to focus on carbon. And again, if you haven't seen like the organic chemistry part of chemistry yet, don't be scared by some of these diagrams. This is kind of intentionally showing all the variation you can get thanks to carbon. Because here is a property that carbon has, and you might want to jot this down. Carbon can make covalent bonds with other carbon atoms in enormously long chains. Okay? So carbon can bond to carbon, can bond to carbon, can bond to carbon, can bond to carbon, can bond to carbon for, indefinitely. So carbon atoms can make covalent bonds with other carbon atoms to create very long chains. And not just straight line chains. You don't have to write all this rest of it down. But there's also, as indicated here, branching that can occur, ring-like structures that can occur, and we mentioned you can have more than one covalent bond. You can actually have 2 or 3 covalent bonds, which we call double and triple bonds. So I just want you to be familiar with that because you'll see it, and I want you to know what you're seeing, okay? The other nice thing about carbon is that these chains of carbon that form have another great property for many living things. And it's that these long chains are flexible. Okay? So not only can carbon make long chains of itself, they're also kind of flexible. What is the element right below carbon on the periodic table?
Silicon.
Silicon, that's right. Silicon, because it's right below there on the periodic table, also has 4 covalent bonds, 4 valence electrons, which can make 4 covalent bonds. Silicon can make long chains of itself, but silicon chains are not flexible. In fact, they're very common in the rocks of Earth, and they're very brittle and inflexible. And that actually makes silicon not a great element for life as we know it on Earth. So carbon has this special role to play. Now, again, we will not talk about like all these different organic compounds, but we will talk about what we call biomolecules, which are organic compounds you find in living things. And we talk about specific ones, and when they're important, we spend a lot of time on their structure. So again, this is not something you would have to like build in your head based on a formula or anything. I would show you these structures. But like I've been mentioning earlier in other classes, I don't want you to be scared of it, okay? Some of this stuff can look intimidating, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of these names can appear intimidating. And if you look on the back of a lot of food products, you'll see a lot of weird words in the ingredients list. But you shouldn't be intimidated by the weirdness of either the structures or the names. So let's look at just a few quick examples. Like cyclo, what do you think that refers to? Yeah, this circular ring-like shape. Now you don't always see this prefix before a ring of carbon's name, but that is something that you can look to get a little clarity. You also sometimes have numbers in front. That looks really weird to have a number in the name of something, but the number usually indicates something happening at a certain carbon. Like the 1 here indicates that this first carbon has this double bond, and this is kind of described here. But if the double bond is found over on the next carbon, we just stick a 2 there to indicate it's the second carbon. So a lot of times these numerical prefixes are just telling you to look at carbon number 1, 2, 3, or 4, and there's something special there. But again, for our purposes, it's not that important. But you can see how these chains of carbon can form, and there's a lot of diversity that you can get out of this. Now, one thing that manifests itself out of this diversity that carbon can produce is this concept of isomers. So we're going to talk a little bit about isomers. Anybody know what an isomer is? Yes?
1 or 2 or more compounds that have the same numbers of atoms of the same element but different structures.
That's it. That's right. So in this case, we see an example of that. If you count up how many C's and H's, how many carbons and hydrogens you have in this molecule, it's actually the exact same as the number in this molecule. And what is it? This is C5H12. Okay? Well, this is C5H12. So sometimes it's not enough just to write out the formula like H2O or C5H12, because in some cases you can arrange the puzzle pieces differently. And so these are what we call isomers. Now there's a few types of isomers. I want you to be familiar with what the names of these isomers mean, but we aren't going to take this very far. I might show you some examples. You might have to match it to a type of isomer, but these are the only types of isomers I really care about at the moment, and I'll point them out as we go along here. By the way, before I talk any more about other isomers, why do you think this chemical is called pentane?
Because that's 5 carbons.
Yeah, pent means 5, just like the pentagon is a building with 5 sides, or a pentagon is a shape with 5 sides. Pent means 5, and you've got these 5 carbon atoms at the core of the molecule. Now, this has 5 carbon atoms, but it only has 4 actually on the main chain, so we use butane is the chemical with 4 carbons, and then methyl, which means 1 carbon, is just kind of off to the side. So again, you look at how weird this name is, 2-methylbutane. Whoa, that's weird. 2 means at the second carbon, we have a methyl group, which is just 1 carbon sticking off of it, and then the main chain has 4 carbons. So again, that is not, I'm not telling you that because I'm going to give you something that looks weird and expect you to look at it and give me an accurate name. That's organic chemistry. Did you do any of this in AP Chem, like organic naming? Oh, good. Okay, so you're probably somewhat familiar with this if you had AP Chemistry already. But if you don't know how to do this, I don't care. I don't care. Because I'm not going to ask you to do it. Okay, so there's another kind of isomer. So these are just general structural isomers is what they call them. The structures are different even though they have the same numbers of carbons and hydrogens and whatever other element there is. There are other isomers though that get a little bit more specific. And this is one example I want you to know. It's called a cis-trans isomer. Okay? So here we have a little bit more than just, oh, they're different. They're different in a very specific way. By the way, what element is the symbol X? What element is that? What element has symbol X here? What does that X mean?
Any other.
It can be anything. It's a variable. That's right. This actually is not a symbol off the periodic table. This happens a lot in your book where they'll use just a variable to represent. You could have a chlorine here. You could have, anything else that makes one bond. Fluorine, bromine, whatever. But essentially what you're seeing here is some kind of relative symmetry. Okay? So we have the 2 carbons at the core, and then we have some arrangement in kind of a symmetrical way of atoms on either side. Now, in this case, these specific elements, am I getting feedback? Oh, it's the other room. Okay. Sorry. These specific elements, let's say they're chlorine atoms that are here. In this molecule, you could have chlorines on this side of the molecule. All right? if they're on the same side like this, you can refer to them as being in kind of a cis position. Cis is the same. That's how you could think of cis, meaning the same. So the two atoms of whatever element, and the example I'm giving you is chlorine, if they were both on the same side, we would call this a cis isomer. It's a way to draw it where they're both kind of on the top of the molecule.
So can you see like
From
when
this perspective.
can you see when the same element is on the same side?
Sure, yes, yeah. Now, to take that just a hair further, it could be a group of atoms, but you can just leave it at element. I mean, that tells you the story. But it could be a carbon with 3 hydrogens, which we call a methyl group, and we'll talk about functional groups here in a second. But yeah, when you have an element or atomic structure that is the same here on both sides. Now, you could redraw this. And sometimes you have to think a little three-dimensionally, and we're going to build molecules with our molecular kits next week, so you'll get a little bit more practice at this. But these two atoms could be drawn and could exist in this molecule in real life on the kind of opposite sides. And the opposite orientation is referred to as trans. That is a trans orientation. So here we have a trans isomer versus the cis isomer. Trans meaning opposite, cis meaning the same. And then it gets a little bit more complicated, or in more complex molecules, and they don't have to be that complex, you can get kind of a mirror image effect or a left hand right hand effect. And I guess I shouldn't say that it has to be a more complex molecule, but these would typically have a little bit more complexity to it. There's sometimes these strange, like in this case you have like L and D. Sometimes I think they use a capital S to represent it. I do not care about these notations. I just want you to understand that if you see the word, and this is a weird word, enantiomer, that refers to a mirror image effect, where a molecule might have a functional group. Everything's the same with a functional group or an atom on one side, and the only difference is that the molecule is kind of flipped in its orientation on the other version of that molecule.
How does that make such a difference? I mean, I feel like that seems like a really small difference.
Hey, it can be. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference. But your book, I think, gives the example. I think your book gives this example.
Is that the one with like medicine?
Yeah, there's like a, what's the,
Ibuprofen?
Math.
is it ibuprofen?
Yeah.
Math. It's math and then like an inhaler.
I'm sorry.
It's like the methamphetamine.
Oh. Yeah, there are a lot of medicines where the active molecule, if it has like the mirror image isomer or structure, it can be totally ineffective, toxic, as opposed to helpful. But that doesn't really answer the reason why. The reason why, at least say in the terms of medicine, is that these molecules are interacting with other chemical components of your body. A lot of times, you're made up of trillions of cells, and your cells will have tiny little chemical structures called receptors. And you see this in commercials. They always draw them as like this, like a Y, and then something fits into that Y-shaped structure. And they're like, this medicine blocks the receptors, and now you won't have an allergic reaction or whatever. Well, what happens is you'll have a very complex receptor, that can kind of attach to one isomer, but it couldn't attach in another way. So you'd be surprised how many things, I think like caffeine in coffee and soft drinks, there's like 2 atoms, and they're not isomers, but there's just like a 2 atom difference between that and the active molecule of cocaine. And that makes a world of difference. So we see a lot of examples like that, and we'll get into a lot more of that. I think in Unit 4 is the one where we talk about receptors and signaling. But yeah, tiny atomic differences can make a big difference. So speaking of these tiny molecular differences, or atomic differences, this is from your book. There's a lot going on in this chart, but I want you really just to focus on this part right here. Now the rest of it, they can give kind of like a 3D representation, and here is kind of, if you were to write it out as a structural formula by hand, they give you kind of names that typically would go along with the naming system for those chemicals, and some examples. But I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really care about that right there. You can kind of block this all out of your mind. But this is a nice little list of functional groups, and I'll tell you what a functional group is here in a second. Functional groups, their name, and then kind of what you would look for to identify one. Now, you need to know these. I am not a huge fan of, like, I'm not planning on giving you like a functional group quiz where I have you match functional group name with the actual atomic arrangement. But there are going to be chemicals throughout this semester that we refer to the subhydral group, and you need to know to look for kind of the SH, the sulfur hydrogen group. Now, just to go back real quick, the X's here that I showed you, I kind of mentioned, we talked about how like, oh, the atoms are on the same side. Well, a lot of times when you have situations like this, you could have, instead of just one atom, a grouping of atoms and have a functional group in that location, not just one atom. Because if you notice, all of these in the drawing, there's a little line that comes off of kind of the core of the functional group or part of the functional group. And that, again, is just a single bond. So you can have this whole group stuck onto a carbon, and it just takes up one of that carbon atom's 4 bonds. Which, these are good examples of that. Now, I don't want to really spend a lot of time right now going through each one, but I do want to point out just a few kind of common examples. For instance, this OH group, which in an ionic form, what do we call OH with a negative charge as an ion? That's the hydroxide ion. But in this case, it's not in like its ionic form. It is covalently bonded to some carbon atom in some larger molecule in all probability. And when you have this hydroxyl group, that's what alcohols are. So ethanol right here is simply the alcohol found in alcoholic beverages. And the eth prefix refers to the fact that there are 2 carbons. Now, you could have 1 carbon here with one of these hydroxyl groups, and instead of ethanol, what would we call that if it was just 1 carbon?
Methanol.
Methanol. That's right. Which, talk about small differences making a difference. Ethanol you can actually consume when you're 21, guys. Okay? Okay? Methanol, if you drink it, it can actually destroy your optic nerve and other parts of your brain, and you can go blind or die from the chemical brain trauma it causes. 1 carbon. So small differences sometimes can make a big difference.
I feel like I've heard, like, when I saw amino group, I've heard, like, amino acids.
Yes, amino acid. This is an amino acid right here, an amino acid called glycine. They are used to make proteins. They are a common component of your food. And the reason we call amino acids is because they have this amine group, which is just a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. So some of these words will actually become somewhat familiar. Okay? Now, I want to stress, thanks to the TV show Breaking Bad and maybe some other cultural influences you've been exposed to, I don't know why the drug that has the street name meth is, like, I don't know, that name comes from methamphetamine, which is the class of chemical that drug belongs to. I don't know how that's related to methyl groups. Methyl groups are very innocent. They should not have their name tarnished. They are simply a 1 carbon with 3 hydrogens stuck to it, a simple group that you find all over the place in the world of molecules. And again, you can have a very complex structure here, and there's your little methyl group. What's that right there? If you can see it.
I can't see it.
It's an NH2, so
It's amino.
that's one of those amino groups. That's right. Yeah. Some of them get a little bit more complex, but you should be familiar with these names and the groups, and we're going to practice that in just a minute. Before we do, just to wrap up chapter 4, they refer to one of the most important molecules we're going to be dealing with in the world of biology, in the field of biology. This is not a complete structural formula. I want to talk to you about what's happening here. And then there's one more slide related to this, and then we'll stop. So sometimes in your biology textbook, not sometimes, I'm sorry, a lot of times in your biology textbook and in all sorts of materials related to chemistry, there are parts of molecules that are important but don't necessarily matter as much in the discussion that you're having about the chemical. And that's the case with this chemical that we call ATP. We give it a 3-letter acronym for a name. And I'll tell you, we'll talk about that acronym in just a second. Now, the A in ATP refers to this adenosine group, or not group, but this chemical called adenosine, which is a major part of this molecule. It's got a fairly complex structure that we don't need to know about. So in your book, they just draw a box and write the name in, and you can just in your head go, oh, there's stuff there, there's a whole arrangement of atoms, and that's not the point of the molecule in terms of our discussion. What is important is this part of the molecule where they did draw out the structural formula, and these are functional groups. What's the name of this functional group right here? It's a phosphate group. That's right. So this is one of the functional groups from your list. It's a phosphate group. We have how many?
3.
3 of them. So what do you think ATP stands for? Adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine with 3 phosphate functional groups. That's what F sounds to make while wearing a mask. Adenosine triphosphate. And then the next slide, I just want to show you why this chemical is important and how it's all simply the functional group or functional groups that make it important. In a month or two, we're going to talk so much about ATP, you're going to get tired of hearing it.
Isn't it like energy? Isn't it related to energy?
Yes, it is absolutely the energy for your cells. This is the molecule that traps and releases energy for almost every single reaction that happens in your brain, in your muscles, in your nerve cells. It's all tied back eventually to ATP. And this is a nice little schematic. Again, we even took the previous diagram and just wrote P's with circles around them. That's a simplified way of writing a phosphate group without writing the oxygens and the bonds and all that. So adenosine triphosphate, ATP, has these three functional groups, three phosphate groups. It can release one of these phosphate groups in an inorganic form, basically meaning separate from the carbon-based chemical that it was attached to, and you get energy released from that reaction. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about what that means to release energy. But essentially, when energy is made available, your cells can take advantage of that and get work done with that energy. I'll give you one guess why it's called ADP after you release it. Yeah, it just means diphosphate, which is two phosphates. So adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate. And the beauty of this molecule is that when you get energy, say from eating, you can just take this phosphate group, stick it back on, and send the reaction that way, and make ATP for yourself for when you need it later.
So why doesn't it have the reversible sign?
Oh, I've noticed that. This happened with the ocean acidification diagram. You know, things can dissociate, but they can also recombine into their original kind of reactant form. Your book doesn't do a good job of doing the two arrow thing, and that's okay. I will, when we get into ATP, we actually have this kind of circular diagram we'll look at that helps kind of drive that in, you know, a little better. But it should. It should.
Does ATP have anything to do with like hydrocarbons, like how I was talking about the energy with that?
So hydrocarbons that your book's talking about, well, the answer is the energy really comes from the bonds between them. And that's a great question that I don't think I've ever gotten before. Hydrocarbons are a good energy source, but typically only if you burn them. In a combustion reaction where you burn a hydrocarbon,
It's like fossil fuels.
yeah, and that's the fossil fuel kind of basis for energy release. We don't literally burn anything in our bodies to make the energy that we need, but we do it through the same breaking of bonds that you would do in a combustion reaction. So before we stop recording, I just want to say there is a fun sheet. I don't care what you think about it, it's a fun sheet on your coursework page called like Functional Group Practice or Functional Group Fun Sheet. And I want you, this is a copy of it right here. There's a brief set of instructions, and you're essentially going to look at these different molecules and identify where the functional groups are, and try to just circle and list the names of them. We can talk about this next class. I might even try to just post a key to it on the coursework page so we don't have to spend too much class time reviewing it. But I want you simply to get in the habit of looking at diagrams that can look complicated and point out, ooh, I know that. that's hydroxyl. I've seen that before. So we're going to stop the video and work on this.